You know, there are certain figures in pop culture that act almost like a Rorschach test.
Oh, absolutely.
Like you say their name, and everyone listening sees something completely different just based on their own generation or their background.
Yeah, it's really the ultimate litmus test of when you actually started paying attention to the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, if I say the subject of today's deep dive to an older generation, they see the baddest man on the planet.
Right, the terrifying force of nature.
Yeah, just this kid in black trunks, no robe, coming out and knocking people unconscious in 90 seconds. But if you say the exact same name to someone from Gen Z,
They just see the guy from The Hangover.
right, they see the podcaster, this sort of lovable, weed-smoking philosopher who feeds pigeons.
And then, you know, if you say that name to a prosecutor from the early 90s or a women's rights advocate, they see a convicted monster. They see a predator.
And that is the paradox we are wrestling with today. The subject is Mike Tyson.
It is a heavy one.
It really is. We've gathered this massive stack of sources and research today to try and make sense of these entirely incompatible versions of one man. But our mission for this deep dive, it isn't just to do a standard biography.
No, we definitely don't want to just read his Wikipedia page or list off his knockouts. That's been done to death.
Right. The angle we found in the source material, and what makes this super fascinating for you listening right now, is that we are analyzing Tyson's life specifically as a character arc.
Which is usually a term we reserve for fiction, right? Screenwriters talk about character arcs.
Yeah, but it applies so perfectly to real life. Because in any good story, a character starts out with a specific worldview. They think the world works a certain way.
And then they go through the fire.
Exactly. They face challenges or extreme trauma or massive success, and that original worldview just shatters. They are forced to reevaluate who they are.
We see it all the time in wrestling or movies. The heel turns face where the bad guy realizes he's wrong. Or the hero gets corrupted and becomes the villain.
We love stories like that because they allow us to empathize with the character and, see our own reflection. It forces you to ask, well, what would I do?
Right. If you woke up tomorrow with $100 million in fists that could literally kill a man, would you be a hero or would you be a monster?
And our sources today are arguing that Mike Tyson is the ultimate real-world case study of that exact transformation. He's this agent of chaos trying desperately to become a beacon of hope.
Or at least trying to convince us, and maybe himself, that he is.
I like that skepticism. We really need to keep that critical lens on as we go through this, because the sources are framing his life as an allegory for the black male experience in America, covering the rage, the glory, the failure, the monstrosity, and the redemption.
So to understand that full arc, we really have to understand the starting point.
The origin of the monster.
And we aren't using the word monster lightly here. That is how the media portrayed him, and often how he portrayed himself. But monsters aren't born, they are made.
Yeah, and the research describes Tyson's early life as a quote-unquote got it out the mud story. But honestly, reading through these notes, it feels like a massive understatement.
It's a euphemism. We aren't just talking about a kid who was broke.
No, this was a very specific flavor of psychological hell.
Right, we have to look at the texture of that poverty, the environment his brain was forming in. His mother ran a brothel out of their home.
I mean, let's just pause on that for a second. Think about what that actually means for a child's development. We are not talking about a rebellious teenager. We are talking about a toddler, a kindergartner.
It means he had a front row seat to the rawest, ugliest parts of human sexuality and transaction before he could even read a book.
Yeah, witnessing his mother with strange men, seeing violence in the living room.
And there is a really heartbreaking detail in the research about this. It notes that young Tyson felt this intense, specific type of jealousy.
Because he saw his mother giving affection to these clients.
Exactly. She's showing warmth, or at least a fake kindness to get paid, to absolute strangers. And meanwhile, her own son feels completely invisible.
That is a massive wound to your attachment style. When you're a little kid and your primary caregiver is showering attention on transactional clients while you're pushed to the shadows.
It teaches you something incredibly dangerous about your own value. It teaches you that affection is purely transactional and that you are at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy.
It essentially wires your brain to believe you have no inherent worth.
And then look at the father figure in the house. The man who was around, who likely wasn't even his biological father, was a pimp.
So if you are young Mike Tyson trying to figure out how to be a man, what is your blueprint?
Your blueprint is a man who controls women, who uses violence to maintain order, and who is completely emotionally detached. That is what a successful man looks like in that ecosystem.
And then you layer on top of that the direct trauma he experienced. The notes are very clear that we have to talk about the assault.
Yeah, he was sexually assaulted at age 7.
Which is a detail that always seems to get glossed over in the flashy sports documentaries. People just want to skip to the highlights of him knocking guys out.
But you cannot skip it if you want to understand the arc. Think about the profound powerlessness of that moment. You're 7 years old, you're snatched off the street, and you're violated.
And you tell absolutely no one.
You just swallow the shame and the rage.
And simultaneously, he's getting bullied relentlessly by other kids in the neighborhood.
Right. We all have this image of Iron Mike as the scariest human alive. But at 10 or 11 years old, the sources say he was a small, shy kid. He had a high-pitched voice, a lisp, and gapped teeth.
He was a target.
He was constantly running home to avoid getting beat up by the older kids.
So let's tally this up for the listeners. You have a kid who feels completely worthless at home, utterly powerless in the streets because of the sexual assault, and constantly humiliated by his peers because of how he looks and talks.
It is a pressure cooker, and the valve is welded shut.
And when the lid finally blew off, it wasn't a slow leak. It was a massive explosion. The research says by the time he was 13 years old, he had been arrested nearly 40 times.
40 times by age 13. That number is staggering.
Mugging, fighting, petty theft. He was reacting to the world with pure chaos.
Because chaos was the only language he'd ever been taught. He was trying to take back some semblance of power, and the only way he saw men take power, through violence.
Which brings us to the moment where the narrative usually shifts to the savior figure. Enter Cus D'Amato.
The architect. The Einstein of fight science.
Now, the Hollywood version of this story is that Cus saved Mike. He took him out of reform school after his mother died when he was 16, gave him a nice home in the Catskills, and turned him into a champion.
It's that classic feel-good sports movie trope.
But our sources today paint a much more complicated picture. It's significantly darker than the movie version.
Much darker. Because while Cus absolutely provided stability, Tyson suddenly had a bed, regular meals, a family structure. We have to be careful to distinguish between stability and wholeness.
Right. What does the research say about that distinction?
It points out that Cus wasn't trying to raise a well-adjusted, emotionally healthy young man. He wasn't sitting Mike down to process the trauma of the brothel or the assault.
He was an architect building a weapon.
Exactly. He saw this raw, bubbling rage, and instead of trying to heal it, he managed that antisocial behavior and channeled it exclusively into the boxing ring.
He weaponized the kid's trauma.
Yes. The sources talk about this psychological concept of the God complex that Cus instilled in him.
Mm-hmm.
Cus looked at a kid who had literally zero self-esteem, who felt like dirt, and decided the only way to fix him was to swing the pendulum as far to the other extreme as possible.
Going from I am nothing to I am a literal God.
There is a quote in the notes that perfectly captures this. Cus told young Tyson, if the prophets and gods had a son, he couldn't beat you.
Man, imagine hearing that when you've been bullied and ignored your entire life. Yeah. That must have been like a drug.
It was incredibly intoxicating to Tyson. But the expert analysis in our source points out how fragile that is. It's called megalomania as a defense mechanism.
So you aren't building genuine confidence.
No, you are building a suit of armor out of invincibility. And Tyson was just a vessel for Cus's creation, this persona of Iron Mike. But if that armor ever cracks, the person inside is still just that terrified 7-year-old boy.
And the mortar holding all of that armor together was fear. I found this part of the deep dive really fascinating, Cus's philosophy on fear.
You would expect an old school boxing trainer to say, fear's for the weak, don't be afraid.
Right, be a tough guy.
But Cus operated on a totally different psychological level. He taught Tyson that fear is like fire. It's just a natural force.
If you let it burn out of control, it destroys your house.
But if you control it, it cooks your food. It warms your home. It powers the engine.
So he essentially taught him to metabolize his own terror. The notes describe Tyson's internal state before a fight as having supreme confidence, but being scared to death.
Tyson has described shivering in the locker room, just paralyzed by the visualization of failure. But he used that adrenaline. Cus had him visualize his knuckles literally piercing the leather of the gloves to break the opponent's bones.
And then as he walks out to the ring, that fear hardens into something else. Once he steps through the ropes, he feels like a god.
And that paradox is what made him so unbelievably dangerous. He wasn't in there fighting for points on a scorecard or even really for a paycheck at first. He was fighting for psychological survival.
Fighting to keep the god persona alive so the scared little boy wouldn't have to exist.
Exactly.
Which transitions us beautifully into the second segment of his arc, the gladiator and the Ide. This is the part of the research that really turns the mirror back onto us as a society.
Because we have to ask why we were so utterly obsessed with him.
Right, to understand that, the sources take us all the way back to ancient Rome, to the historical concept of the gladiator.
Most people just think of gladiators as ancient entertainment, like early football.
Yeah, guys with swords fighting in the Colosseum.
But the research highlights their vital social function. They actually started as a practice at funerals for the powerful and then evolved into entertainment for the masses. It provided what the source calls the vicarious consumption of violence.
Break that concept down for the listener, the vicarious consumption.
Well, civil society requires us all to suppress our violent urges. You can't just punch someone who cuts you off in traffic. That repression builds tension among the masses.
So watching controlled violence provides a catharsis.
Right. It actually kept the peasants from revolting. It provided social cohesion. We watched them destroy each other in the arena, and we get the psychological release without having to commit violence ourselves.
But the catch is, the sources note that gladiators are a protected class only conditionally.
Highly conditional. As long as they fulfill their role, we treat them like royalty. But the second they stop performing or stop winning, that protection vanishes.
And boxing is really the modern arena. The deep dive notes point out that it's the ultimate performance of traditional masculinity, dominating another man through sheer physical will.
But it's also a very unique social space. The expert analysis here is brilliant. Boxing is essentially a safe space where men are allowed to exhibit emotions that are usually totally forbidden in public.
Like physical intimacy, joy, deep pain, and fear.
Yes. The source makes a really poignant societal commentary here. It points out that Black men in America are often only allowed to safely exhibit a very narrow range of emotions publicly, usually lust, anger, or reverence.
But in the sports arena, that emotional range expands dramatically.
It does, but it is strictly confined to the ring or the field.
And even within that context, Tyson felt very different than the fighters who came before him. You look at Muhammad Ali or Sugar Ray Leonard, they were showmen, they were performers.
Tyson wasn't a showman. Tyson was primal. And this is where the psychoanalytic theory comes into the source material, Freud's concept of the mind.
Right. Let's do a quick refresher for anyone who hasn't taken Psych 101 in a while. Freud split the mind into three parts: the superego, the ego, and the id.
Keeping it simple, the superego is your moral compass. It's the part of you trying to follow the rules and do the right thing. The ego is the mediator trying to navigate reality.
And the id is pure, unfiltered desire and aggression.
It's the toddler brain. Pure passion, lust, anger. I want to punch this guy, so I'm going to punch him. No filter.
The argument here is that Tyson represented the entire world's id.
Absolutely. Society acts as the superego. We are constantly holding ourselves back. Tyson was the fantasy of letting go completely. Society lived vicariously through his total lack of restraint.
We loved that he did what we secretly wanted to do but couldn't.
And you can see it in his presentation, the aesthetics of fear.
Yeah, the notes detail how he completely stripped away the traditional showmanship of boxing. All he had the fancy robes and the poetry.
Tyson walked out in a towel with a hole cut in the middle of it. No flashy robe.
No upbeat music either. Sometimes just a single droning note or the sound of chains clanking.
No socks, just black trunks. And he didn't do the typical wrestling promo faces or glare for the cameras. The source says he just stared at his opponents like they were food.
Staring at them like food. That is chilling.
It weaponized that fear we talked about earlier, and the stats back it up. He knocked out 16 men in the first round alone.
Combining that ferocious power with Custiamato's peekaboo style.
Half of his opponents were beaten mentally while they were still getting their hands wrapped in the locker room. They knew they were stepping into the ring with a mythic monster.
And that weaponized fear made him the biggest star in the world. The notes point out he was even bigger than Michael Jordan at that specific time.
Because Jordan represented athletic excellence, Tyson represented something primal and terrifying.
But the thing about myths, and especially about living as the unrestrained Ide, is that it's completely unsustainable. Eventually, reality catches up.
Which brings us to the third segment, the crack in the armor and the beginning of the fall.
And the fall begins with the loss of structure. In 1985, Customado dies.
Right before Tyson becomes the youngest heavyweight champion in history at just 20 years old.
Think about that combination. You're 20 years old, you have the world at your fingertips, unprecedented wealth and fame, and the only man who ever provided you with discipline and guidance is gone.
It created a massive vacuum in his life, and nature abhors a vacuum.
And stepping right into that vacuum was Don King.
The notes do not mince words about Don King. They describe him as a snake.
Yeah, the source material highlights his background. King had reportedly killed 2 people in his past, one of them over a $600 debt.
So Tyson transitions from Customado, a man who lived simply and only cared about discipline and boxing legacy, to Don King, a man who represented pure exploitation and excess.
King didn't want to manage Tyson's antisocial behavior. He wanted to feed it, because a chaotic, unmoored Tyson was easier to exploit financially.
And around the same time, the personal structure collapses too. We have to discuss his marriage to Robin Givens.
The gold digger narrative.
That was the public perception at the time. The media painted it as this massive mismatch. She was the polished Hollywood product, claiming to be a Sarah Lawrence med student, and he was the raw street kid.
Right. The accusation was that she was just using him for his money.
Yeah.
There were claims of a pregnancy that led to the marriage, and then a subsequent miscarriage where she supposedly didn't gain any weight.
The public completely turned on her. But our source requires us to apply a much more nuanced lens here. We have to be able to hold 2 things as true at the same time.
Okay, what are the 2 truths?
First, it's possible that Givens was seeking the spotlight and the financial benefits of the marriage. But second, and much more importantly, Tyson was almost certainly unhinged and highly abusive, exactly as she claimed.
The deep dive specifically references that infamous Barbara Walters interview.
If you go back and watch that interview today, it is deeply unsettling.
Givens is sitting there on national television describing her husband as scary and volatile, saying he has a violent temper.
And Tyson is just sitting right next to her in silence, staring. It's incredibly dark.
But as a society, we largely ignored her warnings. We labeled her a gold digger because it was easier than confronting the reality that our favorite gladiator was hurting people outside the ring.
We wanted the show to continue.
But the show's about to hit a brick wall. The turning point. Tokyo. Buster Douglas.
This is the moment the myth shatters.
The source sets the scene leading up to the fight perfectly. Tyson's preparation was virtually non-existent. He was partying extensively with Japanese women, doing drugs, and having these incredibly lethargic sparring sessions.
He had zero respect for Buster Douglas. He thought he was invincible.
But Douglas had a very different motivation. His mother had died shortly before the fight.
So Douglas stepped into the ring with absolutely no fear. The worst thing that could possibly happen to him had already happened.
And the fight itself reveals just how far Tyson's camp had fallen. There is this unbelievable detail about his corner being completely unprepared when his eyes started swelling shut.
They didn't even have an end swell. For you listening, an end swell is a basic standard piece of cold metal equipment every boxing cut man uses to push down swelling. It's boxing 101.
And because they didn't have one, what did they use?
They filled a rubber latex glove with ice water and pressed it against his eye.
A makeshift water balloon. The source quotes Teddy Atlas, calling it dumb mediocrity.
It proved that the discipline, the science, the fear that Cuss had instilled it was all gone.
And when Douglas knocked him out, the invincibility was gone too. The world saw the monster could bleed. The id was wounded.
And a wounded id is a very dangerous thing.
Which leads us into segment 4. The descent. The prison years, the bite, and the sideshow.
This is where we have to address the rape conviction.
We do. And we need to be very clear about the stance of the source material here. Despite Tyson's continuous denials to this day, the fact is he was convicted and sentenced to jail. The source emphasizes heavily that he is a convicted rapist.
It is an established fact of his record. And the cultural reaction to that conviction is really what the expert analysis focuses on.
Because the reaction was incredibly revealing about us as a society.
It was rampant victim blaming, people publicly questioning why she went to his hotel room, trying to pick apart her character.
Many people actively supported Tyson throughout the trial and the convictions, specifically because he was the gladiator.
Exactly. It highlights this dark societal tendency to excuse a gladiator's sins as long as they continue to perform for us. We were willing to overlook monstrosity as long as it entertained us.
So Tyson goes to prison. While he's in there, he converts to Islam. And when he comes out, there's this massive media push about how he is a reformed man.
But the source explicitly points out that those narratives failed. because they weren't true.
Tyson himself admits now that he came out of prison and was still incredibly messed up.
He admitted to getting a prison guard pregnant while incarcerated. He came out still completely addicted to sex and drugs. The internal rot hadn't been cured at all.
And when he returned to the ring, he just couldn't compete with highly disciplined fighters anymore. Fighters like Evander Holyfield and Lennox Lewis.
Which culminates in the Holyfield ear bite.
Just the ultimate unhinged moment. He literally bit a chunk of Holyfield's ear off and spat it onto the canvas.
Because the boxing skills had eroded. So the ad, feeling trapped and outclassed, resorted to pure, grotesque violence.
The expert analysis calls this the moment he officially lost the heart of the people.
Right. The aura of the terrifying but respectable gladiator was gone. He transitioned into a sideshow oddity. People weren't tuning in to see athletic greatness, they were tuning in to see a car crash.
And the final nail in the coffin of his legendary status was the 2002 knockout loss to Lennox Lewis.
The ad was completely fractured. He was broken physically, psychologically, and economically.
Which brings us to the fifth segment of our deep dive, rock bottom and the eventual transformation.
The void.
Describe the void for us based on the notes, because it wasn't just losing boxing matches.
No, it was a total collapse. Despite making hundreds of millions of dollars in his career, he was $60 million in debt. He was tied up in lawsuits against Don King.
And his physical state was a reflection of his mental state. The notes describe him as fat, bloated, and unhealthy.
And then, arguably the most devastating tragedy of his life occurs, the accidental death of his 4-year-old daughter, Exodus.
She died in a horrific treadmill accident at home. Just unimaginable grief.
The source notes that his drug use during this period shifted completely. It wasn't about partying or celebrating anymore. It was pure pain management.
He was using substances to numb his intense self-hate. He has said he viewed himself as a piece of shit.
He was trying to erase himself, but then a major catalyst enters the picture. His wife, Kiki Spencer.
The notes highlight that she brought something crucial to his life. Not just emotional support, but strategic vision.
She saw a path forward for his recovery that involved pivoting his entire public persona. She pushed him toward Hollywood and mainstream media.
But our source provides a very important critical analysis here regarding Kiki's role.
Yes, the source warns against falling into the good woman trope.
That classic narrative where the break-in violent man is magically fixed by the unconditional love of a patient woman.
Right. While Kiki undeniably helped him course correct, the source notes the concerning tradition of broken men expecting a woman to save them. The quote is, "A good girlfriend isn't a replacement for therapy."
I think that's such a vital takeaway for anyone listening. You cannot place the burden of your own mental health entirely on your partner.
Exactly. But with her strategic push, he did start to shift. And that shift really entered the mainstream with his cameo in The Hangover in 2009.
That was such a bizarre cultural moment. It was really the first time the monster became cuddly.
Or self-aware. The expert notes compare this to a classic professional wrestling trope.
The comedy term.
Right. When the scary monster heel gets older and can't perform at the same level, you turn him into a comedy novelty act to keep him over with the audience.
He was singing Phil Collins on screen, and we were suddenly laughing with him instead of just being terrified of him.
It made him palatable again, and he leveraged that goodwill to go much deeper with his one-man show, The Undisputed Truth.
Directed by Spike Lee, right on Broadway.
That was a huge risk, but it paid off. He stood up there and laid all his demons completely bare.
He humanized the beast, he took ownership of the madness, and started this transition into almost a guru-like figure, which perfectly sets up our final segment today. Segment 6, the third act, or the philosopher phase.
Look at who Mike Tyson is today. He's a successful podcaster. He owns a massive cannabis business. He presents himself as this gentle grandfather figure.
But the source material dives into the deep complexity of his current introspection. It's not just a clean, happy ending.
No, it's very fraught. He talks openly about how much he hates the man he used to be, the monster. But he also admits something incredibly dark.
He admits that he misses him.
There is a direct quote in the notes that is just haunting. He says, "I miss him because when he comes out, hell is coming with him."
That sends chills down your spine. What is the psychological read on that?
It suggests he fears that the monster is who he truly is when he is feeling most alive. The peace he has found now might feel safer, but it also might feel hollow compared to the godlike high of the arena.
But despite that internal conflict, he is actively pushing for a healthier definition of masculinity today.
He really is. He cries openly during interviews. He discusses his trauma and advocates for mental health awareness.
He openly acknowledges that the performance of manhood he learned as a kid, the stoic, violent pimp archetype, is a complete farce, and that bottling up those emotions literally kills men.
It's an incredible irony. The man who arguably represented the absolute peak of toxic, violent masculinity to the entire world is now the one actively deconstructing it for a new generation.
It's a massive shift. But the expert in our source raises an uncomfortable question that we have to ask you, the listener.
Is this redemption valid?
Right. What does his current status as a beloved pop culture philosopher mean to his actual victims? Can a man who committed such depraved acts truly restore himself in the public eye?
The source doesn't offer a simple yes or no. It acknowledges that he isn't fixed. He still goes on long, rambling tangents. He still has moments where that unhinged aggression flashes.
But maybe that ongoing struggle is exactly what makes him so compelling to other broken people. He isn't hiding the cracks anymore.
Right. So, summarizing this incredible character arc we've discussed today.
It's a wild journey. From a traumatized street urchin, to a manufactured god of the arena, to a convicted felon, to a sideshow act, and finally, to a self-help guru.
And the final takeaway the sources leave us with is really a reflection on ourselves. Tyson's story forces us to examine our own relationship with celebrity and violence.
We consumed his unhealed trauma for our own entertainment for over a decade.
And now we are sitting back watching him try to heal from the very destructive behaviors that we loudly applauded and paid for.
It really holds a mirror up to society. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought from Tyson himself to mull over.
It's a powerful quote.
He said, "Men are not meant to be humble. Men are meant to be humbled."
In a culture that constantly demands perfection from its heroes right out of the gate, perhaps the most profound lessons on humanity come from the ones who fell the absolute furthest.
Something to think about. That wraps up our deep dive for today. Thanks for hanging out with us, and we'll see you on the next one.